when one considers, as an international observer, the broad sweep of American contemporary composition, how do you position yourself within that, or do you think about it?
I'm asked this question a lot, actually, how I feel as an American composer, how I position myself in the American tradition. And it always sort of brings me up short, because it's not something I really tend to think about. It's not something I certainly consciously think about when I'm making sort of musical decisions or deciding which way I want my work to go. I think that certainly my background, the way I think about my work in general, has maybe an American tinge to it, although I say that not having much to compare it to, because I certainly don't feel like I have a whole lot of native, inculcated tradition that I need to address in my work. I feel like I have the ability to pick and choose the precedents I want to address, the musical questions I want to ask, and that American music as a cultural phenomenon is, for me, appealingly sort of decentralized, a little bit informal, so because most manifestations of it are pretty much equally irrelevant to the larger cultural discussion here in the States. As far as my work goes in terms of a musical tradition, that's a more complicated question. Is that what you're asking about?
In part, certainly from being active as an artistic director of an Australian ensemble and living in Europe at the moment in Manchester, when one encounters the framework within which American contemporary classical music is presented, it usually begins with Ives, maybe Gershwin, and goes through pretty quickly and rapidly to Cage, Glass, Feldman, Reich, a few other usual suspects. So when I come across your music, I see something that's very, very different. And I guess what I'm curious about is what are the things that propel that difference?
Well, again, this is something that I'm not really sure how to answer, because there are the terms in which I don't really think. Again, I think maybe one thing that makes my work American, if I had to pick something, would be its sort of freewheeling and maybe slightly skeptical approach to the Western musical canon. The way that I do, in fact, incorporate into my work a lot of fairly traditional approaches, materials, structural ideas of repetition, sectionality, ornamentation. I take cues from musical precedents as diverse as sort of the French Baroque, as well as the New Complexity, sort of things in between, and I feel free to pick and choose as sort of a magpie in terms of the European tradition that I feel closest to. I don't feel any sort of program being thrust upon me by my context or my colleagues or any particular performance situations. I'd be curious to know maybe what if you have any specific ideas about my work in terms of how you see it that way, as someone who does have a lot of international experience working closely with European composers, festival organizers, as well as, of course, living and working in two very different, slightly peripheral in some ways to the European tradition countries yourself.
Well, certainly I personally have always been loath to accept the fiction of a nationalist narrative. And I do think somebody has once referred to patriotism as the last refuge of a scoundrel. It tends to be the way people and festival directors and in many cases audiences as well present and are presented with information about how composers live and work, and that is there tends to be some kind of geographical narrative formed around, well, what
right.
do Vietnamese composers write? So if you could group all people who write music in the country of Vietnam in the same way, ditto China, it tends to be a function of labelling, sometimes which has a truth because enough people within that geographic confine subscribe to it and give it a reality and a force. With your music, what I've always been attracted to is its inherent qualities, and that is, you seem to me to have a very quiet sense of imminent violence within your composition. A performer will very, very much be very, very close to and will experience. I'm thinking of Tristan Williams in particular for the performance of Apostrophe 2.
Right. Poor guy.
And that violence, and it's something I've actually discussed relatively recently with another virtuoso exponent of your work, Richard Craig, that violence it's an implosion, it's not an explosion. So the force of it is very, very contained, and it's contained by various rigorous processes within your music. So anyway, I just wonder if you'd care to elaborate upon that. Would you accept that as a dynamic within your work, or would you take that discussion in a different direction?
Well, I do. I mean, I think there's certainly an aspect of violence or physical strain in my work. I'm not personally. I tend to shy away from terms of sort of dramatic and loaded as violence, but certainly I'm interested in the performer's muscular, physical interaction with his or her instrument and ways of making that a little bit complicated, making it a little bit stressful, putting a little bit of strain on the musician. But I try to balance that always. I'm more interested in that not as a sort of purely sort of dramatic and almost theatrical, fascistic, sadistic torture of a performer. That's not what I'm interested in at all. Because I'm always interested in a context of almost, you could call it lyricism, grace, whereby the strain of performing my work, and it is very exhausting a lot of the time, especially for wind and brass instruments, very, very physically taxing. But usually for me, it is, as you described it, sort of an inward violence, an implosion, a sinking in sort of within the musician, and so the audience is almost sort of witnessing a private, introverted, quiet struggle with audible results that, again, are usually, at least I attempt to make them fairly gentle in the sort of paradoxical balancing of these two different directions, which is when my work works. I think that's what I personally find satisfying about it.
What attracts you to that? Because what you have is a very shy, if you like, elusive approach to quite extreme musical situations that you're directing an enormous amount of performance energy, of your own intellectual energy, to a particular moment in time when that's realised. But it's almost as if you're saying to the audience, look away. Or if you're not saying that to the audience, I've always had this sense that there's an averted gaze, that you can't quite look at the object of your work directly. You see it as if it's a shadow. Is that a fair comment, or is that something that you're deliberately striving for, or how you think about your work?
Sure. I mean, of course, you know that several of the pieces I've written for Elysian involve performers literally turning away from the audience and performing with their backs to the audience. One of the things that I find interesting about writing music, full stop, to make a very general statement, is the sort of strange indirectness of the whole process. The way I create a score of the sort of arbitrary, strangely ad hoc evolved symbolic code on paper that a performer then has to read, internalize, study, transform, and then proceed to present to an audience. And I'm interested in the leaks and the gaps in that process. A lot of my...
It's fascinating you say that, because one of the images I entertain of your work, one of the mental images I entertain of your work, is that of wayang kulit, the Indonesian shadow puppetry, where highly detailed and scored puppets made of leather are backlit and then presented onto a screen to an audience. So what you see of those shapes is what which are obscure in themselves, is partly how they function to obscure light and what they let through and what they don't let through. So the whole ritual around it contains a series of very indirect transmissions of information from the way the objects themselves are lit, their degrees of opaqueness, how light goes through them, what's blocked, what then goes onto the screen, how the screen is lit, who is sitting in front of that screen. Again, is that for you? How would you react to that as an image?
Oh, I think it's a beautiful image, and I think there's actually a lot to it. Again, I think one thing that's become increasingly a feature of my work over the past several years, more or less, in fact, starting with the first pieces I wrote for Elysian, starting in 2007 or 2008, is that they begin structurally in their material as very, very simple. There's a lot of repetition of sections, a lot of very simple, almost lyrical, melodic fragments, a lot of echoes and canons and traditional musical devices dating back to, medieval times that if they were presented straightforwardly would be completely transparent and obvious. And then through my use of notation, the overburdening of these materials with detail and virtuosic hyperextension of performative technique and so on, they become veiled, they become shadowed. And so when you see a performer like Tristram, the trumpet player of Elysian, gasping for oxygen half of the way through a 5-minute piece with his back to the audience, squealing and grunting, the material he's trying to present actually begins its life as something very simple and very basic and very elegant in my mind. And the listener then sees that or hears that sort of vaguely, like, as you would say, as in your image, like a sort of shadow, through this veil, this distorting veil of over-detail physical exertion. So again, this violence that we've been discussing is real and is present, but it's inwardly directed, and it's cast upon this this backdrop of calm, grace, elegance. I mean, the two touch points from my work that I often sort of think about in relation to what I'm trying to do are the early Brian Ferneyhough Time and Motion Study 2, with the cellist, strapped into this quasi-torture device, which is an absolutely explicit drama of violence and sadism. And on the other hand, the music of someone like Aldo Clementi, which is very, very calm and very, very plain and very, very straightforward in certain ways, avoids contrast, avoids drama, avoids rhetorical devices. And I think of my work actually maybe somewhere existing almost directly between those two, sort of one filtered through the other. And again, in the work of mine that I like the best, I found a sort of balance between grace, elegance, simplicity, and the sort of very intense, very physical, very visceral violence of performance.
How are those polar extremes of your work that you're postulating evident in earlier pieces of yours, such as Supplement? Well, I'm wondering where the journey begins.
Right. Well, Supplement really is where this specific journey begins in some respects. Although you can go back even earlier to a piece for Cotalius called Hyphen, which I wrote in my first semester of graduate school, even back in 2002. Which again is a very beautiful piece. Its crotales are wonderful, very resonant, beautiful instrument. And the piece is very soft and very gentle and ornamental and elegant in a way. And yet it's performed mostly with the knuckles and the fingernails on these hard metal little discs in a way that actually causes the performer no slight amount of pain and discomfort. And that's, I think, a sort of embryonic view of how these two things coexist in my work. In Supplement, this idea of overburdening the performer so that a pretty simple, repetitive, basic idea gets overwhelmed with detail and just, the overabundance of material comes for the first time. It's the first piece, I think, where I really didn't know what I was doing. Well, that's not fair. I've written many pieces where I didn't know what I was doing. It's the first piece where I didn't know what I was trying to do. I'll put it that way. Because in Supplement, there are 5 or 6 simultaneous melodic lines at times. The solo bass clarinet player clearly cannot play what's on the page. And I don't know, when a performer asks me, what should I do? How do you want me to approach this? I will say, I don't know. Just, here's the piece, play the piece. If I had a more specific idea, I would have written it more specifically. And what that material is again, very simple, repetitive. The end of the piece is 6 staves of looping material overlapping with itself again and again and again. and the performer is tasked with playing this material, which is physically demanding and, of course, mentally extremely demanding. Their job, and I refuse to elaborate on what this might mean, is to play it all. And that ambiguity is what drives the work, and that's the sort of dynamic in the tension between the performer-score relationship that I've been exploring in various ways ever since, basically, for the past 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, and personally, that is the ambiguity that I very, very much love and embrace as an artistic director of an ensemble for my musicians, because it actually offers the musicians and it offers us as a group a capacity to be involved in your music and have experienced a level and layering of involvement that isn't always possible, isn't always present, isn't always required. So quickly, Evan, where to next for your compositional concerns? Do you see particular directions that you're clear about following, or is it a period of exploration for you, or you feel that you've got the ground well and truly set with the extremes you were referring to earlier in terms of being able to offer fertile territory for yourself?
Oh no, I still feel very much like I'm not sure what I'm trying to do, and that's actually a feeling I kind of hope to maintain for as long as I'm doing this. It's not an unpleasant feeling in some respects.
Yeah.
But this idea of structural fundamental clarity, of repetitions, of canons, of basic devices underlying the work is something I'm becoming more and more attracted to, actually. And in the pieces I'm working on now, the piece I'm about to begin working on, I think it's too soon to say how these ideas might go, but I think you might find, in fact, a lot more of a sort of stark structural clarity, a lot of regularity in, the length of sections, the length of pitches, maybe even some pulse here and there, which is something I've avoided quite rigorously up to this point. As someone who's sort of placed himself, again, going back to the very beginning of this conversation, as an American composer, chosen to place myself in a tradition that, broadly speaking, looks to modernism, complexity, as one strand of forebears to my work. This idea of clarity and starkness and predictability of structure is something that I've been very wary of, had a hard time getting comfortable with as an idea. But it's something that's increasingly attractive as a way of framing these ambiguities, these violences that we've been discussing. And I think in future works you might see that balance maybe shifting a little bit towards starkness, towards some sort of productive predictability. But we'll have to wait and see. I don't know how it'll turn out.
I'm looking forward to hearing it.
All right, thanks.
Evan, thanks.